part of this morning, we're doing this deep dive into data and its uses. It's going to be a panel discussion, and it's going to be moderated by Bianca Wylie. Bianca is an open government advocate, and she has a dual background in technology and public engagement. She is the co-founder of Tech Reset Canada and is a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in the Global Economy Program. Bianca, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here. I'm going to get our panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll just do this as quickly as we can. Everybody got their mics working? There's the one. So why don't you go ahead, Rosario, maybe? Go first.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Rosario Cartagena, and I'm the Chief Privacy and Legal Officer at ICES.
Hi, I'm Joe Greenwood. I'm Lead Executive for Data at Mars Discovery District.
Hi, everyone. Matthew Chandy, and I'm with the Region of Waterloo, and I ran our Smart Cities proposal to the Federal Smart Cities Challenge.
And I'm Adam Blinick. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Communications for Uber Canada.
Great. So the way this is going to work is our panelists are going to give us quick presentations to start. It's a little bit from everybody, so you'll hear their context. Then we're going to spend some time with some questions, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. So we'd like to spend the bulk of the time not talking at you, but talking with you is the idea here. And before we get going, I suppose every opportunity to talk about data governance and data and policy is an opportunity to learn. And if personally, if I'm not kind of stepping in it or maybe making a mistake, I don't think I'm doing it right. So that's the preface to what I'm about to say, which is maybe two things to hold as we have this session. One of them, living in Canada in times where we talk about reconciliation, thinking about what it means in every single bit of work that we do as people living in the country. And so one thing that a friend of mine named Justin Beebe shared with me is the idea of the 7 generations principle. And this is the idea that decisions that are made now, we think about their impact in 7 generations forward. And that decisions we're making are putting us in a good, sustainable place. Clearly, settlers in Canada haven't heeded this idea at all. I mean, this is not even, and I think we're at the point now where this is maybe under threat of being co-opted when we talk about policy, but I think this is one thing that where I might be screwing this up is like even me presenting this, because as a white woman, this isn't stuff that I do either, but I would like us to think more about some of the knowledge that's out there and how we apply it to our work. And so how this applies to what we're talking about now is we need to make policy and we need to go a bit slowly, but also go fast. So how do we do those things at the same time and be thoughtful for the long term? And the second second thing I want to say before we get into it is data and IP and a lot of the things we talk about right now, we think about them in numbers, we think about quantification, we think about math, right? This is one type of knowledge, but there is deep and important qualitative traditional knowledge that we also need to bring to bear on the decisions we're making and on the ways that we govern this country moving forward. So I'd like us to always think about those 2 types of knowledge and those 2 types of data, information, or whatever else it may be. So those are just sort of opening thoughts. As we hear from everybody, we'll sort of hear some context in their particular work, and then we'll get into a nice conversation. So thank you, and over to the first presenter. Is that you?
Great,
It's a bit of a lottery here. So whoever slides come up, they're gonna go. So if it's a bit bumbly, that's my problem. That's my fault. Okay.
Thanks, Bianca. So let me tell you a little bit about ICES. So we are a not-for-profit research data institute. We have 7 physical sites. The biggest one is located in Toronto, ICS Central. We essentially collect and use personal health information, more recently personal information, for evidence-based policymaking. That's how we call it. So we are a community of research, data, clinical experts. We have about 500 staff and scientists, many peer-reviewed publications every year. And the reason why we are able to collect and use personal health information is because we have the designation of a prescribed entity under the Personal Health Information Protection Act. So what that really allows us to do is to collect and use PHI, personal health information, I'll just call it PHI, without consent of Ontarians. So it's huge, it's a big responsibility, but what what really that has enabled us to do is to have one of the largest repositories of linkable health data in Ontario. And so we have approximately 18 billion records for over 20 million Ontarians. And because of that huge responsibility, we have oversight by the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. And so every 3 years, we are audited, essentially. We have a triennial review. We produce a very, very large report, and the commissioner reviews it and then gives us a seal of approval or not, I suppose, to be able to continue to do what we do. But really what that means is that in order for us to have this huge repository, we really need to have a strong data governance model in place, or we will lose the trust of Ontarians, and essentially the mission and great work that we do will be lost. And so many of you probably don't know that we exist, but we have been behind the scenes on issues such as concussions, opioids, hallway medicine, wait times, breast cancer, you name it. We're able to collect and use the personal health information and then use that to advise the government on, health system planning. So it's a project-by-project data access model. Internally at ICES, we have role-based access, meaning that we have different levels, level 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on the sensitivity of the data. Of course, level 0 access, very few people have it. Those individuals are responsible for removing direct identifiers, and then there's subsequent coding that happens following that in order to be able to use and link the data. The data has a unique key identifier. Every single use of the data is subject to a privacy impact assessment where, members of my team have to review and decide whether the assessment, whether the use of the data makes sense based on the purposes for which have been identified, all based, of course, on data justification and minimization. Then a data set creation plan. We have, project-specific data that's brought in. So all to say is that the governance model that we have and the privacy and security controls that we do have to be quite strong in order for us to continue doing our work. So we have been around since 1992, so over 25 years, and more recently we have been getting into the artificial intelligence space. We created in partnership with Vector Institute, Compute Ontario, and HPC for Health, what we call the HIDE app, enabling individuals to look at massive population level linked data sets for greater policy making purposes, of course. And really the environment is just an extension of our environment, but it is focused on machine learning. So
You've
I know
got under a minute. Yeah.
Yep, so last slide, so limitations, opportunities. Of course, I mentioned we have a strong data governance framework, which also means limited flexibility. So when we look at some of the ideas that we have, some of them may not be possible in the current legislative regime that we have. That's something I'd be happy to discuss about afterwards. The important upside is that we can collect without consent. So it enables us to be able to have the data that we need to produce the analysis and the algorithms and so forth for policy making and ensure that we don't have biases in our results and that we have strong data quality as well. Because we do have this infrastructure in place, it enables us to continue to build and maintain the trust of Ontarians. And I will leave it at that because I noticed I'm out of time, but happy to answer questions afterwards. Thanks.
Well done. See this? Did you see this modeling of sticking to 5 minutes? See, that was perfect. That was perfect. And I'll stick this alarm into the mic to shame you if you don't stop at 5 minutes. So, who's next? Joe. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was invited to try and speak about data sharing in the smart cities. And this is kind of informed by trying to build ecosystems where different organizations, public and private, share data to build valuable ecosystems of new applications and services. We've done this in location services, in healthcare, in energy, in banking, and many other sectors. And some things of trying to do that in smart cities have struck me as fundamentally a bit different. So I wanted to kind of say, what have we learned and what's so different here? And a little journey from Mars, we're trying to understand this data trust as a way of getting along that journey. And Sean over here is going to go a fantastic intro into that later, so I won't go deep in that. But we've been trying to explore that as a viable path. And so something kind of struck me that, it's a bit of a statement of the obvious. And that before you can agree how we're going to share all this smart city data, we've kind of got to agree how we're sharing a city. And what's up for stakes here is, what is the social contract around how we use a city before I can write a data contract that lets you do that? And that any data governance, any legal mechanisms, any technology sits in a social context. And the real thing that's happening here around this debate, when you look at Quayside and all the rest, is we're kind of debating how we share the city. And we're trying to do that while understanding very complex concepts of privacy, security, and data sharing. And so in 5 minutes or less, I'm going to try and pull out...
3.5.
3.5. Here we go. How do you link the social contract with a data contract? Okay, so we've heard privacy and security is table stakes. There is a heightened expectation about what that is. And against that heightened expectation, there's actually a slightly heightened doubt that it really exists in our lives. So in smart cities, you have to meet a level of expectation that me as an individual in a public realm can go about doing what we've always taken for granted. Yeah, I don't believe that exists in the rest of my life. So convince me. And so you can't also give consent. So some really important concepts, and why ICES is such an amazing model, is they have a very evolved governance model which deals with the fact that there's not consent granted. You cannot meaningfully grant consent as you walk past a sensor, yet we have no meaningful governance model that surrounds it. So that's going to have to get evolved. And against that, we're squaring this against a values discussion. This is the public realm, yet there's private gain at stake. And we want everyone to have a social equity on a part of that. And so how do you, and we debate it, so the debate gets centered in who owns the data. Who uses the data is more important than who owns it, because the use is what creates value. And differentially saying what use you can or cannot do and what its value is really hard. And I say that because I used to help run the UK government's largest data business. And we built it on differential licensing, and then forced to open source large swathes of it because it's so damn hard to do in the public realm. So there's some real kind of tension in here because we also want local economic gain. So I want everyone to benefit, I want to make money, but I want my local people to make money and not big license, not big corp. So I can't write a license that does all that in one. Okay, so you're going to have to noodle through and create a more open framework about how you think that value exchange through. And the trust and other models are very interesting concepts to get there. And the other one is, we want to be represented in this decision. And right now, we know how to give consent for me, but we're saying about how do I give consent for we, like we collectively, in this discussion. And so there is a growing expectation of being informed and asked and engaged about data use, and to understand its implications at a social and wider level. So this is more about education, about transparency, and about dialogue, and how you provide that about how these digital public services will be delivered. So in our social contract, we understand how physical services are delivered because we kind of interact with you and we see it.
You've got a minute left, Joe.
Okay. We don't always see that in all the rest of them. And here's the trump card. Consumers are fickle and they'll vote with their feet. So you have to design with them in mind. And in this futuristic world of a connected IoT land, they will choose and use services that they find useful. There's a whole psychology that's around behavioral economics. And you'll be surprised about what they do and don't consent to and what you think is there. And the important thing is everything in that picture was designed by the private sector, largely, and delivered by semi-public or private. So how do you encourage the private sector to actually want to design for every citizen's need? The underrepresented, the poor, the disadvantaged, and others. Because those are your digital innovators, and you need their services to come to market, and you need them to serve those needs. We wrote all this up in our primer. If you want to read the words, this is boiling that down. There's a set of aspirations that are being articulated around this that we think we've distilled. That means there's some very strong design principles we need to get in mind, and those principles will flow through into our governance structures. So I invite you, this is our first stab. It's an open source resource. Please hack away at it, download it, fork it, and do what you need to it. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. You can tell I don't use this timer often. Sorry, everybody. Okay, you want to next up? And I'll shut my phone off.
Oh, you need that one, sorry.
Thank you, Joe. That was great. And
Well,
good.
Well, thanks. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm with the Region of Waterloo, and I've had the privilege of leading our Smart Cities proposal to the federal government's Smart Cities Challenge that was put out at the end of 2017. And so, you know, when we were tasked with, when my team was tasked with putting together a proposal for the federal challenge, we, you know, sat around a room and started going through the list of all the different smart city projects that we had undertaken in this region. And one of the things the federal government wanted us to do was to be ambitious in the way we approach smart cities, and also really how we break down those community silos, leveraging data where possible. So we really got into some of the research that we had done already around quality of life in Waterloo Region. And one of the things that we noticed fairly quickly was that through that research, one of the areas that we actually have a lot of challenges with is child and youth well-being. We struggle from one of the lower high school graduation rates in the province. We, you know, 1 in 5 kids don't feel connected to their community. 1 in 3 kids are susceptible to developmental learning challenges here. So a lot of things that people don't naturally associate with Waterloo Region and all the exciting things that are happening here. So we thought, okay, you know what, let's try and dig into this further. Maybe go in a different route, look at a social challenge rather than a typical infrastructure challenge, which we have lists and lists and have done so many projects on. So we actively started to work with our child and youth service sector along with our tech sector. And so first of all, that was a big win for us because it was the start of this tech for good, and really tech coming together with our social service sector to understand what the problems were. The big thing that stood out to us as a community here was the challenges that we face around data. And I don't think it's a surprise to many people in this room that social service organizations often struggle with their data capacity and the ability to leverage the data that they do collect to identify where improvements can be made, inform the decision-making process, make the investments to improve quality of life for whatever part of the community that you're looking at. So we decided to select that. We, you know, the federal government is putting up a $50 million grant for a winning community. We decided to say, you know what, we're going to build a whole new measurement framework and a bunch of new technology solutions to tackle the challenges our children and youth are facing. And we're going to select that, and we're going to try and become the best community in the country for kids, and hoping that wins it for us. So for us, a big part of this was understanding what, again, how do we measure? We started this process. One of the things we noticed was data capacity amongst our social service organizations ranges. You have the bigger organizations like the school boards, for example, they have data capacity. Some of the smaller organizations, they either are doing it on the side of their desk or, you know, or they don't even have the knowledge to do that. So one of the things we noticed was a lot of inconsistencies around data, a lot of gaps, a lot of duplication. Different organizations were trying to collect the same sets of data, but using different approaches and then reporting different results. And we had no true way of measuring. So we actually have, we developed a whole plan to try and close that gap here in the community. UNICEF Canada, we actually partnered with them. They've built a whole new national index around how to measure a community using 120 indicators across 9 domains on child and youth well-being. So we agreed to build the local community measurement framework for that. And so where we are at today is we've actually come up with a whole proposal around a data collaborative.
Got 1 minute left.
Okay, and that data collaborative really is something new for us. So we actually tried using the term data trust, but there was so much resistance to that actually from a lot of socials, like there was a lot of questions that came up around who owns the data. And so for the purposes of our proposal, we ended up sticking with the term collaborative. But we actually had to go through a process because everyone, particularly in the social service sector, and when we're talking about data for children and youth, everyone is hypersensitive about what you said is it's not who owns the data, but who is using the data and what's it going to be used for. So we actually had to develop a framework that provides some of those assurances to the community, and we actually ran a pilot using artificial intelligence during the proposal period. That's actually laid the foundation now for data collaborative that we want to build out region-wide in the next 5 years. So
Beautiful.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. Adam, over to you for the last 5.
Perfect. I hope I won't take up 5. I was added somewhat late, and so I'm going to really keep it short.
Go for it. Shorter the better, man. Go
Good.
for it.
So I think I'm going to make just address 3 broad things. 1, where Uber was when it comes to data sharing and our overall principles around data. 2, where we are today. And 3, I think where the conversation can go, especially vis-a-vis public entities. So I think it's not telling tales out of school when I say that. I joined Uber 4.5 years ago, or over 4.5 years ago now, and we were a very different company back then. I think we predominantly saw ourselves as a Silicon Valley startup in the tech space. Didn't really have an appreciation, I think, for our roles within cities. I mean, frankly, we were pretty small at the time, and I think that role has actually evolved. But we didn't really have a position when it came to data. I think we viewed it as the data that we were collecting from our customers was ours, and that relationship was just between ours and our customers, and we didn't really necessarily have a position in terms of what our relationship with cities should be like, and if we had an additional responsibility. Things have changed quite a bit over the years. We have grown quite a bit, and we have come to realize over time that we do have obligation to our cities, and that we need to continually earn the trust of our partners and be better actors within the environments in which we operate. And that has really changed our thinking, and one of the ways it's changed our thinking is in terms of data. And we went from, I think, being a company that had a very skeptical position on this and was really reticent to share data, to actually trying to be proactive on it, to take a principle-based approach, but not really wait for things to happen to us, but actually try and further the conversation. And so this is a deck. I'm not going to walk through the deck, but it is about actually a product that is available, and I kind of almost just wanted to make people aware that it's available if they didn't know about it, as it's, I think, illustrative of where we are today as a company. So this is a product called Uber Movement. Basically what it is in a number of cities, including Toronto, we have taken the data that we've collected over the years, and we've anonymized and aggregated it. And in addition to that, we've taken shapefiles from cities. And basically what we've done is we've created this free website that anyone can log into, and they can play around with the data themselves. And right now it's limited. It's kind of like the first version of it, but it's basically you can take a city, and you can see here there's like geotiles, and you can select a time of day, so like peak period morning, peak period afternoon, midday. You can pick the day of the week, many days of the week, and compare traffic patterns between one tile and another over a period of time. And so say for example, you knew that the gardener was shut down for a parade on a given day, or for construction. You can see how that day of traffic was affected vis-a-vis another day that month, either within the same year or with the previous year. And so, as I said, this is a free service that we offer. This is data that we just make available, not just to cities. You guys can log on to this and actually play around with it yourself. And we're actually looking to improve on this product. Right now, we're beta testing in partnership with Shared Streets, not-for-profit based out of the US, how we can actually add in street segment level speed data. And that will even help planners and other city leaders even more use the data that we've helped generate to do their own planning. And I think this is just one way that we're doing it. We're obviously having more conversations with cities, with other entities. Shared Streets, which I just mentioned in DC, we've partnered with them and other transportation providers to provide them with data that they can aggregate and anonymize and help DC actually do curb space management. And so there's a lot of ways that we can actually leverage what we've actually collected over the years.
You got one minute left.
Oh, wow, that was impressive. I didn't realize how fast it was going.
I know.
So the one thing I would say is where we want to take the conversation is actually elevate it with cities. I think the thing that we have realized at times is some of our city partners for good reason, want data, but sometimes they're requesting data from us that we think can compromise our customers' privacy. And I don't know if there's always an appreciation how even origin destination data is PII information and can compromise an individual. And in fact, New York, as an example, released some of the data that they collected for us, and a data scientist was able to demonstrate how you could de-anonymize that data and actually show how people are moving. And so what we would love to do is actually have that elevated, informed conversation with cities, transit agencies, understand better what they are looking for, and figure out how we can tailor our information in a scalable way that protects people's privacy and indeed protects our own commercial welfare. But there's a really informed conversation to be had, and we want to be at the table to have it.
Beautiful. Okay, so let's thank these wonderful model panelists for their 5 minutes, sticking to it. Thanks for bearing with me as I learn I don't like the timer feature on this phone. So I have a few questions, but I'd really like to spend the remainder of the time having a conversation in the room. So if anybody has questions already, please let us know. You can stick your hand up, but we're going to start talking. And I'd like to extend my umbrella of, these are hard conversations, and I hope we can all be empathetic with each other, that we may say things today and we change our mind in a couple weeks, months, maybe next year, that as professionals, this is a time we have to get comfortable with saying, I don't know. And like, well, yeah, you know what? I changed my mind about that thing, which is not common in a lot of the cultures that I think a lot of us work in. So I'm going to extend that to all of you. You can change your mind on something you say today, even though, So I think one thing, to bring it back to the datafication of the world that's happening right now, I think we haven't really attained, especially in the cities version of life, some social license to be capturing the data that is captured now, or even in some of the healthcare perspectives, that people don't really know how much is already being captured. So that's one of our big general public education challenges. But in the face of that, and you're all nodding, and I think we all know this is the truth, there are still opportunities that you must see where you think, yes, but given this opportunity here to improve health, maybe to better transportation, whatever. What are the places where you see such a strong opportunity that you're not willing, to really drop it? Or it can become a very particular focal point where you see this opportunity to say it's worth it to go down this sort of risky business road here where we don't really have social license. Like, is there something in your work right now where you're saying, okay, this one particular thing is so worth it? And if none of you do, this is going to be a short conversation. So I really hope you got something, or else we're all wasting a lot of time.
So I guess just to clarify, the idea of the social license became most evident to us a few years ago when we were looking at our strategy plan. So in fact, we've developed a public advisory council. It's just really beginning and getting off the ground. But the aim of this public advisory council is really to help us to better identify what are the strategies in which we can be more transparent and to ensure that the way in which we're using the data resonates with the public, and that we're moving in the right direction. We conducted a focus group a few years ago, and my colleague Charles Victor can speak to it a bit more. I wasn't working at ICS at the time, but the focus group really found that citizens felt, there was first of all, I think they were quite surprised and shocked that we were able to collect health data without consent. But at the heart of it, it was the use of the data, and us being a not-for-profit, independent, arm's-length organization from the government was a very different matter than us using that data and disclosing it to the private sector. So that was a key finding, which I think doesn't surprise anyone in the room, but that really underpins a lot of the work and ideas that we have. I didn't answer your question directly, just to have an add-on.
It's helpful, and I think you just said something nonprofit, which I think is fascinating, because it seems to me that a lot of people are fine until there's a commercial benefit to the use of their data. And so I think this becomes one of those vectors of because then maybe people who are using your data are making commercial use, or are they not?
Well, I guess it's the way in which the data is, because the majority of our work is linked towards advising, the government in sort of health system planning and evaluation. We do allow third-party researchers to access our data, but it is de-identified, highly risk-reduced. It goes through, a tool that we have that ensures that there is very low risk of someone being identified. But when it comes to the private sector, if they do engage us as a third-party researcher, then we are the ones who are using the data.
Cool. Because health, for me, is one of the cases where I was at a conference and I was listening to people talk about the fact that they wanted to be identified because they wanted the pollution in their neighborhood to be known to the government. So it was this interesting case where people were on a stage saying, no, don't anonymize me. I want them to know where I live, and I want them to know what my health is like where I live. And I thought it was this really interesting counter story to what I'm used to hearing. So I think there are cases, and I'm sort of eyeballing down there, if there's cases where, people who use transportation or people in cities, cases where you think people are like, no, I'm actually fine with the use of my data in certain contexts. Like, have you tripped over some of that from public voice or from residents? Or?
I think people's relationship with us, so obviously we have our own history with our own issues, which I think honestly keeps us more honest now, because I think we went in this really accelerated way from that scrappy startup that people are enamored with and somewhat rooting for to a much larger company where skepticism started setting in. And our CEO always says that we're at this messy intersection between the digital and the physical, which is a little bit different than a lot of the other Silicon Valley companies. People interact with us in a very visceral manner. They have human interactions through our app in the real world. And so I think there's generally a different type of relationship that they have with the app. They're paying for a service, they get in a car, they leave the car. So there's something very tangible that's happening with the data, and we're not monetizing the data on the back end. We're making the app more efficient, but there's something very concrete that's occurring. So I don't think we've run into the same problems. To kind of your first question, I don't have a good answer about the present day, but I would say that I think the past has really informed how we look at situations now. And because of the scrutiny, which I really think has been a positive force function on the company, we want to grow quickly, but we need to grow responsibly. And we just don't have the luxury, I think, of kind of moving fast and getting things wrong. And so we have to put things through that lens of whether or not our customers would be comfortable with this, because this is not something that's going to be 5 years down the road that people notice. These are things that are actually happening today and that they're actually experiencing.
Yeah, Joe, when you're looking at cities, and what's jumping out to you as one of those high urgency opportunities, and if not, no problem, honestly. None of this might be on fire, and that's fine. We have more time to deal with it. But is there something that you think is really the thing that we should be using as a starting priority in cities and data?
I'll save my don't know joker till later.
Okay.
So my guess then, transportation and movement seems like a pretty tangible one. So people are happy to don't see their data used for commercial or public gain where they benefit. And so the fact that we're happy to give our location data or to help to Waze or to other traffic routing applications tends to suggest you'd be happy to donate the tracking of that to optimize congestion and flow. And you kind of indirectly are, because we have sensors in roads, but we could more directly do that from phone and telephony data and more autonomous and connected vehicles. Would people be willing to donate that into a pool of data that optimizes flow? Probably. That seems a fairly tangible leap. And I think the other thing, the model about how we might want to deal with some of this builds on what ICS was discussing and describing, which is how do we have kind of citizen-based councils or advisory groups on these new governance mechanisms, probably supported by expert advisory, but citizens adjudicate over all sorts of very complicated issues. I don't think we should, if we enable them, I think they're perfectly capable of having a very important role in whichever governance structures we put around this.
And I'm curious from from social services or from government, one of the things I'm struggling with right now often is how much more data do public servants need to use to defend decisions? At what point are we overdoing it on the data and underdoing it on trusting the expertise of decades, if not centuries, of public service and what they know? This is one of these ones where I think a lot of the programs ideally need more funding, at which point they would be more functional. And, you know, like, is there a bit of that tension in your work?
Absolutely, because, well, first of all, data is always telling us a new story, right? So yes, we have the history of what's worked and our approaches in the past, but data is starting to tell us if we're really having the impact that we think we're having or we want to have. And so, you know, in our case here, it's told us some things that we need to pay attention to. So through this process, we've really seen our community and our service, our not-for-profits that are providing the services and parents say, you know what, we need to do something about this. This is a great project. This whole idea of targeting and being more efficient with investments, understanding where we need to direct and build programming around is a great idea. They like the concept of using data, but then they're like, well, hold on a second, how much of our data is going to be used by private sector partners? So, you know, for example, we had a couple of our partners say, you know, we have this whole proposal for a mental health app, for example, for youth, who told us they want that. Right. But the parents, a lot of the service providers are saying, okay, well, if they're using that, what type of data are we pulling from that? And then there's this whole conversation about, well, we need to pull that data to understand how we're doing, make improvements, identify where youth are really struggling when it comes to mental health. So there's this like give and take where we're trying to go through this de-identification process, find this right level of aggregating data. Also, for us, it's been, this proposal has identified putting in sort of like smart city labs and learning centers across the region. And we want to target that infrastructure where we see kids struggling the most. Right. But a lot of people have told us, yes, that's a great idea, but it also, you're devaluing that part of town, or, you know, in those neighborhoods. So it's this constant battle where we're trying to have this conversation on the value of data, what value of what you know, how data is transforming the way we deliver services and how it can help improve the life of kids. So it's this constant back and forth.
Yeah, because I think we've all lived through decades now of decision-based evidence making, right? Like, this is a thing that we are all pretty good at doing and politicians are great at doing. And I think I'm concerned sometimes that all this new data is just giving us more material to stall on decisions that we should be making, right? So I think that's where it's gonna take some serious, like, that's where I think that the role of the public service right now in some cases is gonna have to be to push, you know, back to basics on policy that don't necessitate all this additional proliferation of data collection.
Yeah, but I also think that that data telling us that we have a problem, it forces the politicians and everyone in the public sector to do something about it. Because, you know, the Smart Cities Challenge has forced us to be very open about some problems that we're facing, and it's all based on data. So we can't just walk away from it now. It's forcing them to make some decisions, and we will, as a community, have to say, no, you know what, we have to do something about that. So data has told us a whole new story here that will drive some decisions. So. Right,
and this is good because I think it's holding two truths. Like, both these things are true, what we're saying, right? So it's like, how do we get the balance right? Because I think, you know, I was talking to Curtis recently about, you know, restorative justice as a concept. You know, with childcare, with social services, a lot of the stories are told and they're known. Like, we know where some of the issues are, and collecting more data is actually ending up in more profiling and discrimination. You know, like the state's track record with getting more information to defend its decision doesn't land well for a lot of people either, right? So I think all of these things culturally, if we're gonna start to shift our policy style in some of them, you know, like, how do we balance that qualitative, quantitative piece? I'm just finding that that's difficult, right, as we're introducing new things. So looking around at the room, has any of this prompted or triggered any thoughts or questions or challenges too? I always say at the beginning, if you hear something you totally disagree with it, like, this is the time for critical discussion, right? So anybody hear something and think, not at all, or I want to challenge that, or it's like, yay, Canada, right? No, yes, thank you, good, a couple of bright sparks here, let's go.
I get the idea of privacy from an organizational standpoint and the idea of accountability and policy around that. But as more and more data is collected by more and more different organizations and it's made available in various different ways, is there a collective problem around data where perhaps we could, we may have some health data over here or some epidemiological data over here and this sort of stuff, and then given the collective data, maybe I can take some pieces here and come up with a picture of society that may be nefarious or problematic. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts around this collective possibility as we have more data showing up here and there.
Yeah. And I'm going to riff for 30 seconds to let you think about this, but I love that you brought up the word collective, because I think one thing that we're looking into now as we deal with data policy is what are our legal constructs. And for privacy, for example, both the constructs of the Privacy Act and PIPEDA are about the individual. Like, we don't have a legal framework for collective in the sort of Western legal sense in Canada. So I think it's really important, and I also think it's a glaring omission from the frameworks we're working in. So, yes.
So I guess from the health perspective, when it comes to non-health data, we have challenges on collecting and using non-health data and linking that with our health data. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the social determinants of health, but certainly, being able to link mental health data, with traffic congestion, like there's just so many different things that you can link with health data that would be quite valuable. But one of our biggest challenges is our legislative framework. So we have been collecting and using for 25 years, and really truly internally we have a strong, what I believe, not just on the privacy and security side, but also on the research and analysis side. A review, our internal review that happens on ensuring that the data quality is accurate, like the introduction of the biases that you're referring to. I don't think we have all the checks and balances in place, but being able to link the non-health data with the health data for, in the smart cities context is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have.
Yeah, and I saw another hand, and I also want, okay, great. Can someone bring a microphone over? Thank you. I'm going to go rapid fire, so if others have questions, please stick your hand up. Yeah.
So I didn't catch your name from ISIS, was it?
Yeah.
ISIS.
ICS.
ICES.
We once were ISIS, and
ISIS?
last year we rebranded to ICS.
Well, so in my community, we actually did something really innovative. We created a not-for-profit shared services GIS team, so municipal and utility shared service GIS. And when we did that, and because the data set was sitting outside the enterprises, public health came and said, can we play in the sandbox? And many years later, we ended up realizing that the data sets that were missing in terms of solving community issues was really around social service. That was the big data gap. So when we started looking at different projects, one of the things that became clear was that there's a big gap between health and social service, but yet human well-being, which kind of brings these two worlds together. I'm curious, my question is sort of around, how does your organization help to create that holistic approach to the gap of social data, social service data, to tackle the issues kind of in the middle, like a mental health issue?
Yeah, so 100% that, the holistic view of an individual, of a society, and so forth is really important. Social determinants of health is really the basis for that. We do have agreements in place with, ministries related to social science data, social service data, immigration data. We are stewards of Indigenous data as well, so that is something that we haven't talked about yet today, but that's we have a strong relationship with First Nations, Inuit, Métis groups in the province, and being able to link that data for evidence-based policymaking is at the heart of what we're aiming to do. But the biggest challenges that we have, again, linking it back to legislation, is that for the health data, it is the Personal Health Information Protection Act. For the non-health data, it is FIPPA or the Privacy Act. We don't really deal with PIPEDA at all. And then when we want to collect and use the social service data or any type of data that belongs to any ministry related in Ontario, we're dealing with the enabling statute of that particular ministry, which sets out what they can disclose or not disclose. So we are living in a situation with a hodgepodge of different pieces of legislation, and every single time we need to collect and use non-health data, it is a legal analysis that members of my team have to undergo to see whether we can collect and use it. So we are actively pursuing channels of having that dialogue with with key stakeholders, with government, as to how, because ultimately it's not just the health, and health is not just disease, it is holistic.
Right, and this is where I start to think about, got a hand at the back. Sometimes I wonder if Statistics Canada isn't like, yoo-hoo, we're over here, been doing a lot of this for 100 years, guys, hey. And I'm starting to try to picture for all of us, like, where do we draw on StatsCan and what it does? Where do we draw on pre-existing governmental and municipal data policy and what it's doing? And what is this new vector we're opening up here? Like, we're not reinventing the entire idea of how we manage governance, for social purpose. So I'm kind of curious, just to, as we hear this question, but also in the back of your mind a bit, to think about, where do you feel like things are falling short currently? Or are we just inventing things because there's a commercial push, which I think is a big part of the narrative here. Yep.
That's a really good segue to what I want to ask as well. So Statistics Canada produces data that are really more sort of aggregate insights about aggregate cohort. So the data that we're talking about collecting today, though, comes down to the individual levels as well. And so it strikes me that right now, Adam is just about the only representative that's talking about direct value transfer back to the individual who gave Uber the data in the first place, right. Whereas everyone else is still pretty much talking about more that kind of aggregate impact, right? So impact to society at large, etc., which is also just important. Just want to hear across the panel, what are your thoughts on accruing value directly to the individual in a way that's comparable to the value of the data they provide in the first place versus aggregate? Because we make that demand of private sector all the time. What about public sector and community then?
Right. So we'll go across and maybe start at the end. Adam, you want to go first? And do you want me to you got it?
I think I got it, but I felt like he was giving me a softball, so I was like, I just agreeing with him.
Yeah, I think your case is actually the one where this is clear, just if there's anything else on top of it before we move across here.
I mean, I think we're actually at the intersection, and I think that's actually been the fascinating evolution for us, is actually appreciating the fact that we have a broader responsibility, and that, in fact, like, if we want to continue to grow, our growth is actually going to come from figuring out how to make transit more efficient and actually moving people towards transit. It's going to actually be about moving people towards bikes, because it so happens for us that where our growth is going to come from is convincing more people to get out of their own cars. And I think where we have to grow as a company and improve as a company is having those conversations with our municipal and provincial stakeholders to convince them that we're moving forward in earnest in this, and that our information, the way we can actually have a relationship with them, is one that can be mutually beneficial. And so that's maybe the only kind of finer point I'd put to it.
Right. So for everybody else, sort of in the public sector frame, bringing it down to what we're all used to in policy is we give stuff up, give it to StatsCan, the social contract is you get policy back, right? Like general policy. But is there an individual sort of negotiation you're thinking about now in the public sector that's different? And if so, what does that look like, or how's that going?
Well, so as part of our project, one of the things that, we've partnered with UNICEF Canada, and they have actually started the dialogue on so they actually have a whole platform on the youth's right to the data that they produce. And so they have a whole policy on that. So we are now actually trying to figure out how to integrate that at the local level, so that they call it the rights of the youth when it comes to data. So the thing that we're up against, though, is the reason I talk about aggregating data is because there's such a stronger push from everyone else who is currently collecting the data as to protecting the individual identity. And so this is that give and take, which we're just starting right now and trying to figure out how to do it. I mean, that's the ideal place we'd like to get to, but there's a whole journey that has to happen. Because right now it's just trying to have that conversation of letting people sort of, first of all, share the data that they collect, but then getting it deeper and deeper down, so you can actually have an individual youth can understand or have better knowledge of what services they're accessing and for their own personal well-being and health. There's a whole process that we're working towards here, and we've outlined that in actually our proposal. That is one of the things, is how do we explore getting that data back to the person who's creating the data instead of just bringing it up and data flowing one way.
Perfect. Joe?
Sure. So in the public sector, and it's flipping over into the private realm as well, would be this notion around smart disclosures, which is a fancy way of saying, that's my data, I would like access and use it, please. So that's my energy data, please can you disclose it to me so I can use it in this third-party energy management app to manage my home. That's my health record, I'd like access to my health record, I'd like to securely share it with X.
So, and this is more like knowledge and then monetary value, right?
This is raw data, raw PII, my personally identifiable data about an individual, or a company can do the same thing, which is to say, how do you give access rights to data that public institutions hold, so that you can access it and they get value out of it, not in other ways. And of course, GDPR extends that into the private sector in the European realm by saying any data custodian has to be able to disclose that. So that's my insurance or my mobile phone data. I would like it so I can go shopping for a better deal. That's direct return of data and value back to the consumer in its most explicit sense. Yeah. So those are models which I think will be gain traction.
Cool.
And I think there's other opt-in models around cities.
Okay, good. You got something else? We got about 10 minutes, just under, so if you have questions, please go, and we're going to keep going quick.
So we're actively looking into this. We are preparing a report for the Ministry of Health on this very issue. We work closely with Health Quality Ontario, and something that we've been alerted to, a very good example is that we have data on the opioid crisis, and we can tell physicians which patients have been overprescribed opioids. But because we can't re-identify our status under, the Personal Health Information Protection Act doesn't allow us to re-identify, that's something, for example, that we would not be able to tell physicians how many patients have been or which are the patients that have been overprescribed. So we are dealing with limitations in the legislation. There is a designation called a prescribed person, which does allow you to, would allow us to re-identify. So we're actively exploring that. And of course, our Public Advisory Council is really key to that, to see whether, is that something that that we should be doing.
Right, because I think, questions? Anybody got stuff? Just to riff on this a bit. Okay, good. Got a hand in the back?
Yeah, I had a question.
Oh, yeah, good. Hi.
Hi.
I got another one here.
So part of the challenge or the issue is informed consent, not just consent. So, who is responsible in our society, in a smart city, for ensuring that people know what they're consenting to? Are there any mechanisms for educating consumers and also for policing people who are collecting information but maybe not doing it in as transparent a way as they should be?
Good. I'm going to offer this one up to Joe.
Okay. And I can't use my I don't know Joker card.
You can.
So this is around informed consent and who should be governing that. So I guess there is an existing legal framework that covers the public and private sector. I think you'd probably know the details of that even more precisely. But ultimately, the private sector is covered by federal jurisdiction, which is part of the issue in smart cities, is that the city actually has very weak jurisdiction on consent and IP, it jumped out, or IP and use of data, which is one of the real kind of nuances here. So in that sense, it's also largely retrospective enforcement rather than proactive. So most privacy legislation at the federal level is saying when there's a breach or when that consent wasn't informed enough, then we'll enforce. There's nothing that's proactive in the same sense. And I think that's part of the challenge in the smart city context, and where when you walk past a sentence, you can't give consent.
No,
so
and I think it's a really good point.
That's where it's breaking down.
Yeah, and jurisdiction, like that jurisdiction point is huge, which is why the city's piece is emerging, I think, as an important place where they can extend some new policy or some new thinking, possibly. You had a question. Do you guys feel the startup-ness of the noise and the thing? Like this is ambiance. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to go back to something that Rosario had mentioned, and you introduced the term bias. And so when we look at a lot of the new tools coming in terms of AI and ML and whatnot, how do you see the the governance framework and maybe even the concept of the social responsibility and the social construct, how do we build our responsibility in back to the individual and the citizen that we're properly accounting for the potential for bias to be introduced, and how do we do that explicitly or implicitly?
Yeah, got some thoughts on that? Okay. Machine noise, enter, no, go.
So for our purposes, because we are the individuals who work on these data sets are scientists. So inherently, in a research study, they have to ensure that they are looking at biases and confounders and so forth. I mean, that is something that is certainly relevant in any sort of study plan or design. But holistically, I would say, I mean, that's where we look to our Public Advisory Council as well as being a huge partner for us and ensuring that we reduce the risk of that being placed. But I certainly see, I mean, overall, it's not just for our institution, but just overall, bias and, being extremely relevant to the discussion.
Yeah, and to pick up on this, oh, you got a hand, just really quickly. We got one over here. Okay, good. We have 5 minutes. We have 4 minutes. So we're going to do 2 questions and really quick answers. Go ahead.
Okay, I had a really quick question, which is when collecting data, there are 2 problems that arise. One is missing data, and one is bad data. For example, you have misidentified a person or something. How, as a citizen, do I get access to the data to correct incorrect data that's collected about me?
Okay, good question. I'm going to go, anybody want to answer this one? Yeah, go, Joe, go.
Some of the issues around smart disclosure and consumers' right to know about data held is also the same mechanism by which they have the right to correct or the right to delete. Again, in the Canadian construct, that's not as explicit as, say, it would be under GDPR, which is those rights are more explicit and apply private and public sector. It is reasonably clear in the public sector in terms of holdings how to exercise that right, less so in the private. And I think there's an interesting thing around smart cities, which is all around sampling, if I can put it that way, around a lot of this is going to be sensor-based, at which point sampling introduces bias and sampling introduces noisy and bad data. So I think the whole science of understanding what your sample of data is or isn't, and more importantly what it isn't, is really important in understanding how well you can generalize from that machine-generated sample to the population, to the traffic, to whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so the data science around that extrapolation from sample to population is really important.
And it's a good piece of advice on governance mechanisms going forward is how do you address that and make sure it's better than right now, which is who has the time and energy to go to the OPC or to the Privacy Commissioner. Go ahead.
Working? Yeah. I think, though, like you say, there is the right to access to your personal information, both the provincial, municipal, and federal level as well. My question was, there was some discussion about advisory boards. I'm curious about the makeup of these advisory boards across the sort of panelists, what you've seen. Is it a mix of public, private, maybe academics, ethical experience with reviews there?
Yeah, and just to tie this into something that was in the news in the last couple of days, is Google appointed its AI advisory board, and there was a very, very good and sustained critique leveled by a lot of people in civil society saying, you've appointed someone from the Heritage Foundation that denies the existence of transgender people. Like, what are you doing? That's not the floor. Like, you got to put the floor up so that we're not spending all of our time now working on issues that, we have decided we don't want to be the starting point. So I just want to tie this question very much to something that's very timely. Have others got other examples around, how you select that? I mean, it's clear that it's very important who's there, and we know people already aren't represented in data. So you've probably had decent experience with this.
Yeah, so not, I'd say not directly because I wasn't involved in the interview process, but the individual who's the manager responsible for the Public Advisory Board, there were notices in the libraries and local newspapers, just local YMCAs, like it really was, a citizen just like you and I, and not really focused on someone from academia and someone, from but there were a list of questions that she had to ensure that the individuals did not have inherent, racist or whatever, but she did ask a series of questions, and so we are having our first public advisory in-person meeting on April the 6th, so it's still new territory for us as we explore.
Good. And I think we'll end now, and I'm going to do it by dragging myself through a mistake I made when I started to speak this morning. We are small communities working on this, especially in Canada. We're in smaller groups, municipalities, towns, whatever else. And so I think we need to, I referenced some knowledge as it came from a friend. My friend is also an advocate, a professional scholar. And we need to think about how we lift up and how we work within different knowledge sets and different communities, because a lot of us as white people, white women in particular, white men as well, don't have good muscles around this yet. And so we need to be screwing this up a lot, because you can't just get up on stage now after years and years of racism and institutional problems and just say, now we're gonna solve it in AI, because it's ridiculous, right? So we have to be willing to really screw this up right now, and I'm screwing it up all the time. I've done this twice in the last 2 weeks. I was like, yeah, my black friend. I'm like, that is the worst. It just reverberated in my head, like, what are you doing? So you will do it too, and then just screw it up, own it, and keep going, because discussions about justice are difficult, and we've been putting them off for a long time. So we got a great chance here, but let's really do it, and let's be ready to screw up and be kind to each other when we screw up. That's my closing thing on thinking about data policy. Thank you all so much for everything. It was a wonderful discussion.